The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, UN75 The Multilateralism We Want, Psychological Contributions to Building Bridges Among and Within Nations. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. When you join today's webinar, you selected to join either by phone call or computer audio. If for any reason you would like to change your selection, you can do so by accessing your audio pane in your control panel. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time. We will be collecting these and addressing them during the Q&A sessions. There are two documents available for download in the handout section of your attendee control panel. You may access that at any time during the webinar and download. I would now like to turn the presentation over to Dr. Leslie Popoff.
Good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you all to the 13th Annual Psychology Day at the United Nations. Over 1,000 of you are here today. Welcome, distinguished UN delegates and representatives, psychologists, students and professors of psychology, and all who have chosen to be here. My name is Dr. Leslie Popoff, and I am the president of the Psychology Coalition at the UN, which is the organizer of today's event. PCUN is composed of representatives of national and international psychology-related organizations accredited at the UN. Our mission is to inform and advocate for the application of sound psychological principles to promote human rights and health and well-being for all people throughout the world. We are focused on supporting the attainment of the UN's 17 Sustainable Development Goals to transform our world. The very first book devoted to the role of psychology and behavioral sciences at the UN was just published and was edited by two members of the Psychology Coalition, Dr. Harold Tacouchian and Dr. Elaine Congress. The information will be posted on the PCUN website. The first annual Psychology Day took place 13 years ago with the goal of promoting the important role psychology can play in addressing global concerns. Since then, Psychology Day at the UN has addressed a wide range of global challenges each year. We've tackled the issues of gender equality, health and well-being, climate change, the global migration crisis, and conflict resolution. As an organization and as a society, we continue to face all of these challenges and more. But at this moment, I want to speak to the unprecedented threat of the COVID-19 pandemic. It has threatened both lives and livelihoods. To quote Secretary General Antonio Guterres, COVID-19 is threatening the whole of humanity, and the whole of humanity must fight back. Some of you may sadly know someone whose life was lost due to this pandemic. An esteemed colleague of our psychological community, Dr. Jean Lao Chin, is one such tragic loss. Jean was a staunch advocate for diversity and inclusivity, particularly for ethnic minorities. She was a champion for women's rights and equality for all. Jean worked fiercely to promote change throughout the world. She will be greatly missed. As with any crisis, we seek to find those silver linings that can help to rebuild a sense of hope and possibility. One such silver lining is the international reach this virtual event has made possible. We have participants from 76 countries, and this program will be recorded and made available on the Psychology Day website, making it possible to reach many more. The devastating impact of this pandemic requires a broad global response. It requires us to come together in collaboration to build partnerships and bridges. This begins today with all of you choosing to be present here, demonstrating a commitment to work together not to rebuild the status quo, but to build a better, more inclusive and resilient world. Psychology Day at the UN is truly a team effort and could not be realized without the support of our mission co-sponsors. The permanent mission of Palau to the UN has been a co-sponsor of Psychology Day since its inception. The permanent mission of the Dominican Republic has also been a co-sponsor and a supporter for several years. And we are grateful for the co-sponsorship this year of the permanent mission of Mexico to the UN. Now I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Dr. Rashmi Jaipal, one of the main organizers of this event. Dr. Jaipal will provide some background and context to today's theme. She is Professor Emerita of Clinical and Cross-Cultural Psychology at Bloomfield College. She has done extensive research in the area of cultural diversity and is a 2017 Fulbright Scholar who researched the implementation of mental health services in India. Dr. Jaipal is currently the lead representative of the American Psychological Association at the UN. Welcome, Dr. Jaipal.
Thank you very much, Leslie, and thank you very much for that wonderful welcome and start to this event. Could I have the first slide? Oh, great, I have the first slide. Okay, so we are really extremely pleased to present an event this year in support of the UN and multilateralism. The UN was formed in the aftermath of World War II and was based on the idea of countries coming together to collaborate to prevent such conflicts in the future. However, the UN is in need of support right now. Can we go back to the first slide, Elke? Yeah, stay there until I say next. Yeah. The UN was formed in the aftermath of World War II. So the point is it was brought together the countries came together to collaborate. However, the UN is in need of support right now because there has been a global increase in nationalist movements and increasing xenophobia, racism, and intolerance in many parts of the world. These trends are unfortunately impacting attitudes towards the UN and the concept of multilateralism upon which it is based. And just as nationalist sentiments are on the rise, the world is currently facing a major global pandemic of COVID-19, where the need for multilateralism and international cooperation is greater than ever before. Over the years, the collaboration between the 193 member states of the UN has grown and led most recently to the landmark agreements of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Global Compact on Migration. Despite large power imbalances, vast differences between member states in terms of culture, economic development, political systems, and national interests, it seems it is still possible to achieve some degree of collaboration and cooperation. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah. However, last fall in the UN General Assembly, a stark divide emerged that now defines international relations, a split between globalists in favor of multilateral relations and nationalists. There have been growing criticisms of the UN and its agencies, with some countries pulling their funding from the UN and severely diminishing its capacity to perform its functions. To counter these trends and strengthen and transform the multilateral system, the General Assembly decided to recognize the 75th anniversary of the UN in 2020 as an important opportunity to hold governments accountable to the commitments they made to the UN Charter in 1945, and an opportunity to demand progressive improvements through a UN75 summit in September this year dedicated for this purpose. The theme for the summit is the future we want, the United Nations we need, reaffirm our collective commitment to multilateralism. Next slide. Next, yeah. The Secretary General has launched a global dialogues initiative to start grassroots discussions about this theme. The UN75 Task Force has issued a dialogues toolkit for this purpose, and since January, discussions have started all over the world. The purpose of these dialogues is to raise awareness about the need for multilateralism and inspire people to think about the kind of world they want in the future. It is vital that our voices are heard at this crucial time. So they ask that people hosting dialogues send their feedback to the UN75 task force so that their voices can actually be presented to world leaders at this September summit. The Psychology Coalition at the UN is therefore pleased to present this Psychology Day in support of this theme and the Global Dialogues Initiative. So if you want to join in, the links for the UN75 website and Dialogues Toolkit is on the Psychology Day website, or you can find the toolkit on the home page of the UN75 website. Next slide, please. Next, yeah. So in thinking about why it is important to support multilateralism and the kind of world I want, I drew on my own experiences at the UN. And what I've learned so far is that there's a tendency to think of the UN as one entity, which has the same powers as a national government governing a country with the power to enforce policies and legislation. However, this is a misconception. The UN is not one monolithic entity, but a complicated intergovernmental system, a gathering of 193 countries in a General Assembly of peers, which strives to come up with intergovernmental policies and agreements, but with no power over each other to enforce them. It consists of many parts, which is why it is called the UN system, consisting of the main organs of the General Assembly, the Security Council, the Economic and Social Council, the UN Secretariat, and so on. And next slide, please. Next slide. The UN agencies such as the World Health Organization, UN High Commission on Refugees, UNICEF, UNDP, I'm sure people are familiar with many of them, plus the civil society component, which consists of hundreds of NGOs accredited to the UN. Can we have the next slide, please? Yeah. And then lots of NGOs, plus there are also lesser known UN global coordination activities, such as the International Maritime Organization to coordinate safe and secure international shipping, the Universal Postal Union, the World Meteorological Organization, that are all essential for the global coordination of vital services and multilateral problem solving among countries. Imagine trying to manage such a vast set of intergovernmental agencies without any mishaps. The public may be more familiar with the mishaps and criticisms of the UN, but less familiar with its positive aspects and the kind of multilateral platform it provides. Next slide, please. So I wanted to share my own experiences at the UN, as I was often surprised in unexpected and positive ways by what I saw. In 2014, I had the good fortune to attend sessions of the Open Working Group for Sustainable Development that resulted in the agenda for the Sustainable Development Goals. It was a thrilling experience to witness the making of such a landmark, paradigm-shifting agreement where 193 countries were actually able to agree on a progressive model for human and earth-centered sustainable development. They seemed genuinely enthusiastic and keen at the end of a long and grueling process to push this agenda forward. And the wonderful people called to do this work, their goodwill, inclusive and generous spirit, humor and skill as facilitators of the negotiations, the ambassadors of Kenya, Hungary, Ireland, and the Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed, among others, were a real pleasure to watch. I also found that the UN provides a platform for a democracy among nations, a place where even the smallest or least developed countries can be heard alongside rich and powerful ones and can make an impact. For example, the small Pacific island nation of Palau successfully spearheaded a lobby group of member states alongside psychologists that got mental health into the SDGs for health goal number 3. It was really an exciting and rewarding experience to be part of this initiative. The UN also provides a platform for some of the most marginalized voices, the indigenous peoples, who in many parts of the world are experiencing threats to their land and resources from the extractive industries. Every year, indigenous peoples come together at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues to advocate with member states for the implementation of their rights under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples adopted by the General Assembly in 2007. One of the most interesting and moving experiences I've had was attending the Permanent Forum and witnessing indigenous peoples from all over the world, from the Amazon rainforest to the Arctic Circle, gathered together in solidarity to make their voices heard. Voices that, if not for the UN, would never have come together and been heard at a global level. I've also heard panels of unusual combinations of countries sharing knowledge with each other. For example, the heads of state of Ethiopia, South Korea, and Kazakhstan sharing best practices. Or the Oceans Conference, where I heard a wonderful story about the Environment Minister of Gabon in Africa agreeing to collaborate with Argentina on the creation of a South Atlantic marine sanctuary after learning that leatherback turtles from his country regularly swim all the way across the South Atlantic to the shores of Argentina. Animals building bridges between countries. These countries ordinarily would not have come together like this if there was not this kind of international forum. And there are many more stories like this. I hope my love for the UN comes through. I have found that it is the global hub of a wonderful energy brought in by grassroots NGOs and activists who bring a spirit of hope and possibilities for the future. To preserve and reform this multilateral platform is truly a worthwhile endeavor. So to come to our panel, psychology is rarely included in social policy discussions, but really has a great deal to contribute. In the current public health crisis, for example, health psychology can facilitate international collaboration on combating global pandemics such as COVID-19. Social and cross-cultural psychology can deepen understanding of the rise of nationalism, authoritarianism, and xenophobia, and provide evidence-based best practices for improving communications between groups. The Psychology Day program will have 2 panels consisting of leading experts in these fields to discuss their research at the national and international level. There will be 2 moderators who I'll briefly introduce and whose full bios are available on the program. Dr. Walter Reichman, who will appear now on the screen. Dr. Walter Reichman will be moderating the first panel and is a professor emeritus with a long and impressive career in industrial organizational psychology from Baruch College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He is a partner and vice president of Org Vitality, a management consulting firm, and is the representative of the International Association of Applied Psychology at the UN. Dr. Maisa Akbar, who will also now appear on the screen, will be moderating the second panel and is a groundbreaking psychologist and author. Her work in defining the existence of urban trauma unpacks how people of color are in a state of crisis due to oppressive societal systems. She is a board-certified clinical psychologist and assistant clinical professor at Yale University School of Medicine, and also a representative of the American Psychological Association at the United Nations. Be sure to read their full bios on the program. We have a great program with really stellar panelists lined up, so I'm going to hand it over to Walter Reichman for the first panel. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Rashmi. I welcome the virtual audience from around the world to this virtual presentation of Psychology Day at the United Nations. I'm looking through my computer screen beyond it and seeing 1,000 happy people anticipating what will be an extraordinarily wonderful program for you. I just want to review some of the process. There will be 2 panels. I will be moderating the first panel. My colleague, Maisa Akbar, will be moderating the second panel. After the presentation of the 2 people on the first panel, we will go to questions from the audience for 10 minutes. At the end of the 10 minutes, Then the second panel will begin. They will make their presentations. When they complete it, there will be another 10 minutes of questions to the people on the second panel. When that 10 minutes is completed, we will then bring all of the speakers together and we will have a half hour for questions from the audience. We want to involve as many of the 1,000 people who are here in this process. So please, as you have time, send your questions in. They will go from your fingers to the magic of the internet and will come back to our speakers and they will respond to the questions. I now have the pleasure and the honor to introduce our first speaker. He is Fathali Moghadam, and I think he will come on the screen at this point. And he is Professor of Psychology and Director of the Interdisciplinary Program in Cognitive Science at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He has an extensive, fantastic biography, and you can see that on our website. But I just want to mention a couple of the books that he has written, which are so appropriate and so apropos for this particular moment. For example, one of them is Threat to Democracy, The Appeal of Authoritarianism in an Age of Uncertainty. Another title, equally provocative, The Psychology of Dictatorship, The Psychology of Democracy, Mutual Radicalization, The Psychology of How Groups and Nations Drive Each Other to Radicalization. Dr. Moghadam has a wonderful career and a wonderful life experience that I'm sure influences the work that he does. He was born in Iran. As a young boy, went to England, was educated in England, and then returned to Iran in 1979 after the overthrow of the head of the government. He was there during crucial periods of time, during the time when the Americans were held hostage. He was there during the first 3 years of the Iran-Iraqi war. He then left and went to Canada, was at McGill University, where he wrote and he taught and he researched. And then in 1990, came to the United States and then came to the university at Georgetown. It is my pleasure at this point to thank Professor Moghadam for having come to America and thank him for being a part of this presentation. The virtual floor is yours, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor and pleasure to be part of this Psychology Day at the United Nations. As noted, I was born in a low-income, non-Western country, and I'm particularly concerned about the decline in multilateralism because the poorest people in the poorest countries are most detrimentally affected by this decline in multilateralism. I want to begin by doing what psychologists do best. We're best at analyzing behavior. And for me, the decline in multilateralism is a form of behavior. And to understand that behavior, we have to first begin with the obvious, that is, the decline in multilateralism has not taken place in a vacuum. Behavior always takes place in context and has to be understood in context. The context in this case is not just a decline in multilateralism, but the decline in open societies, the decline in democracy, which has been noted by Journalists Without Borders, Freedom House, and other authoritative sources. So we have to understand this phenomenon that we're interested in the context in which it is taking place. And what I want to do in this brief presentation is to give a thumbnail sketch of the kind of research I have been doing with a focus on the relationship between micro processes individual cognition and social skills, and the link between these and macro processes, that is, societal changes taking place at the macro level. I want to particularly focus on what I refer to as political plasticity. Now, of course, psychology has been researching brain plasticity extensively in the last few decades, but it's only very recently that we have turned to what I call political plasticity. That is, to what extent can we change our political behavior? How fast can we change our political behavior? What are the limitations on our changes in political behavior? And these are very important questions for us because looking historically, we have made some progress from dictatorship towards democracy, but we don't have what I call actualized democracies, fully developed democracies. And psychologically, the question is, how can we move towards actualized democracy? In particular, what are the characteristics of the psychological citizen that we need? What kinds of cognitive capacities, social capacities do we need at the citizen level in order to achieve and sustain a democracy? This is a question that concerns not just non-Western countries. It concerns Western countries as well, because as we know, there has been a decline in press freedom, there have been attacks on the free press, and a decline in the quality of democracy in some of the most important Western nations. So my concern here is with political plasticity, and I'm starting with this focus on context and particularly the relationship between the macro processes that we live in and our individual level psychological processes. And I want to highlight how this is a very complex relationship. Changes in macro processes are not always going to lead to changes in micro processes. And the link between these is through political plasticity. Let me give you examples. If we look back over major revolutions since the French Revolution, what we realize is that revolutions deposing dictatorship very rarely lead to democracy. Look at the French Revolution, where the king is killed and then Napoleon rises. We go on to 1917, the Great Russian Revolution. From the Tsar, we get to Lenin, Stalin, and on and on and on to the present situation with Putin. Look at the situation with Iran, where we had the one dictator deposed, but unfortunately leading not to a democracy, but a new form of dictatorship. The Arab Spring, the struggles that the Arab countries have had trying to move from dictatorial systems to democratic systems. So the move from dictatorship to democracy does not come easily through revolution. Now, some may say, well, what about the American Revolution? Doesn't that show that political plasticity can take place very quickly? I would say not at all. If we look back to Athens 2,500 years ago, free men could vote, not slaves, not women. We come to the American Revolution almost 2,200 years after that, and we get to a situation where the American Constitution gives free men the right to vote, not women, not slaves. And it took another 2 centuries before women got the vote in America. And it's only recently that minorities, at least on paper, have the right to vote. So my first point here is that as a psychologist, I would focus on the very gradual, step-by-step process of movement towards democracy. Political plasticity is very limited, and we have to look at the long term in order to understand changes in progressive actions and ideas. One of the limitations in political plasticity is in what I call the democratic citizen. Psychologists have turned their attention to the requirements of democratic citizenship. That is, what are the characteristics we need at the individual level to nurture and sustain democracy at the macro level? Now, this is a very important question because, as we see, even in so-called advanced Western countries, there are large sections of the population who are politically very inept at participating in politics, at taking advantage of the opportunities they have. And here, psychologists have played some role in trying to articulate what we need in a citizen in order for that citizen to be a full participant or move towards full participation in a democratic society. These are all very important questions about the link between individual level behavior and macro level behavior. Another theme in current research in psychology is the critical discussion about group and intergroup relations, and what is the ideal organization? How do we best manage diversity in society? We know that multiculturalism has been the favored policy over the last few decades, but in recent years, very recent years, we have had a rethinking of multiculturalism, and at the international level as well. The focus on differences, the focus on so-called race, apparently reflecting genetic differences, which is of course incorrect. The focus on celebration and construction of group differences rather than on the celebration of commonalities in human societies and across human societies. One of my research themes has been what I call omniculturalism, omni meaning all, focusing on the characteristics of all human beings rather than exaggerating and manufacturing group differences, focusing on how all human beings are psychologically very similar, are in many important ways sharing commonalities rather than being different. And I believe one of the most important moves we have to make in order to strengthen multilateralism is to focus on omniculturalism and shared commonalities among all human beings. Genetically and psychologically, humans share a great deal more than they have differences. And this is a point that we need to make as psychologists at the UN and across the world. Finally, let me come back full circle to this issue of the decline of multilateralism and the reasons for the current weakness in democracy as well. Globalization involves many benefits, but it also brings challenges. And one of the challenges is that it creates perceptions of threat. One of these perceptions that I have studied is the threat of the outsider, the dissimilar other, the threat of invasions from dissimilar others, And psychologists are doing more and more to highlight the consequences of this threat and to understand this threat better. And I believe in the next few decades, psychologists should and will do more on this front, because as we attempt to expand international cooperation and multilateralism, there will be more and more movement of populations across national and regional boundaries, and this will lead to some groups feeling threatened, some groups feeling that they need to defend their nation, their religion, their language, etc. And this is one of the areas in which psychologists have important contributions to make in helping nations deal with this perception of threat from the outside. I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Magadan. You've given us a lot to think about, a lot to talk about, and I hope we will have some great conversations after we complete the next speaker. So thank you so much. Glad that you're here. Look forward to conversing with you as we move forward. I'm now going to introduce our second speaker, and she is Dr. Susan Mickey. Again, an extensive set of credentials. She is Director of Health Psychology and Director of the Center for Behavioural Change at University College in London. In addition, she serves as the expert advisor on the United Kingdom Scientific Influenza Group on Behavioral Science and COVID-19. She is a consulting scientist to the World Health Organization on COVID-19 and behavior. She is also an expert advisor to the Public Health England and the United Kingdom Department of Health and Social Care. With all of that, I must tell you the thing that most impressed me about Dr. Mickey. We began planning this process many, many months ago, long before the epidemic came around. And when we contacted Dr. Mickey and asked her if she would participate, she said that she would, but she would not fly here. She would not come here. She would send something in. And we said, well, it's okay. You know, we can pay for your plane to come. And her response was, no, I will not fly. I will not contribute to pollution. I will not contribute to climate change. And my thought was, wow, here is a person of principle, a person of integrity. I was delighted that well, none of us flew anywhere. I am so happy that you're here. It is my honor to present a person of principle and integrity. Dr. Mickey, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Walter, and I'm delighted to be part of this panel. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm going to talk today about a psychological perspective to transmitting or limiting the transmission of COVID-19. Sorry, just get my slides to move. Sorry, I think I'm going to have to ask somebody to, oh, there we go. So just to say that I'm director of a Centre for Behaviour Change, which brings different disciplines together to think about these huge problems facing us, and also to translate scientific evidence, knowledge and expertise to policymakers, planners and everybody who can use it. As was said earlier, I'm playing a role both within the UK government setup and also assisting with the behavioural science lead, Elena Altieri, at the WHO, and I'll say a little bit about that work in a minute. So just to say something about our UK government behavioural advisory group, we have psychologists ranging from health, social and emergency psychologists, but we also have anthropologists, sociologists, behavioural scientists and communication experts. And we draw on a range of sources to advise the government in its decision making, published literature, unpublished reports, surveys, interviews, focus groups and expert opinion. To show you the range of papers that we present, We present general ones, such as how to improve adherence to government guidance, options for lifting or tightening restrictions, and effective communication strategies. And then very specific papers, for example, on school closures, self-isolation, household isolation, social disorder and policing strategies, presentation of diagnostic and antibody testing, managing deaths and funerals, establishing social bubbles or micro-communities, and many more. This is just to give a flavour of the range of topics that we tackle. Obviously, as scientists advising government, all we can do is communicate our findings and our advice and hope that it's taken up or paid heed to in decision making. We've already heard about behaviour, and behaviour is at the heart of the COVID-19 pandemic, indeed of all infectious diseases. It's the pathway by which the coronavirus is transmitted, and changing behaviour is key to suppressing the pandemic that we're all struggling with over the world. And psychologists have much to contribute to in changing behaviour. And my experience working with policymakers in our government and others over many decades is that communicating the role of psychologists and of behaviour can be done efficiently with frameworks and models and diagrams. And in the short time I have to talk with you, I want to present some of those to you. So some of the challenges and solutions I've found in working with policymakers. When we work with and across governments, there may be differing agendas, incentives, and indeed terminology. And there's always a challenge to try and ensure that psychological thinking and evidence have an impact. And as I said, some of the solutions I find is using frameworks and models that simplify without oversimplifying, and also help in translation. And using templates, i.e. ways of structuring thinking, to structure complex information into actionable recommendations. So thinking about the behavioural route to suppressing the pandemic, if we could improve adherence to the following behaviours at population level, we can suppress the pandemic. These may seem like small behaviours, but if they're changed, they add up to a huge impact. Washing hands with soap, not touching the T-zone, i.e. your eyes, nose and mouth, sneezing and coughing into tissues and disposing of them, and social distancing. In some cases also wearing face masks. So we could solve a big problem by changing these relatively small behaviours at scale. And I want to now show you a diagram that myself and my colleague Robert West put together to demonstrate the behavioural transmission and also the blocks to transmission. It will look complicated, but I will share my slides afterwards so you can see them in more detail. So here we have the paths to the viral transmission. On the left, you can see the infected person who expels droplets, because this is how the virus is transmitted, and through various types of touching surfaces, objects, it ends up with the other completed red blob on the top right-hand corner, where others become infected. So through air, through surfaces, this is how the virus travels. Now here we have the blue box that shows isolation and social distancing, which separates the left-hand infected person with the virus that's being transmitted from the right-hand person who is at potential risk of becoming infected. And now I've added the green boxes of some blocks to this using tissues. And now we have the grey boxes of using face masks as appropriate. And here we've added the box at the top of maintaining physical distance, In our country, it's 2 meters. In other countries, it's other distances. And in purple here, I've now added washing hands with soap or sanitizer, further blocks to this transmission process. And now in green, disinfecting surfaces and objects. And finally, in orange on the right, do not touch your T-zone, your eyes, nose and mouth. That is where the virus gets into your body. So by showing the behavioural route by which the virus is transmitted from one person to another, one can then show the interventions that block these various transmission routes. And I think this is a way of helping people really see what's going on and think about policies and practices that can help. If you want to see more about this, in Nature Human Behaviour is a longer paper that includes a diagram and all open access, and also some blogs in the British Medical Journal. Now, one of the ways in which psychological knowledge can help is to show that the types of interventions that are needed really depends on the type of behaviour, and as our last speaker mentioned, the context within which that behaviour sits. So let's take these 4 relatively simple behaviours and have a think about what psychological knowledge might say about how to change these. We know that just telling people that these are good things to do and they ought to do them is not usually enough to change behaviour at scale, which is needed to stop the transmission. So when we think about washing hands with soap, this requires establishing new rules for many people. And we know from evidence that certain kind of plans called if-then plans, if I'm in this situation, then I will do this behaviour, are very effective. So the situations of coming into buildings before eating or preparing food. However, when we come to not touching the T-zone, this is a very different kind of behaviour. This is an automatic habit. The limited evidence we have shows that people are touching their faces 20+ times an hour, usually without being aware of it. And this may be habitual or may be in response to urges such as itches. And so for this behaviour, just having rules is not enough. We need to develop incompatible behaviour. For example, keeping your hands folded in your lap, in your pockets, sitting on them, or just keeping them below your shoulder level. Then when we come to sneezing and coughing into tissues and disposing of them, this requires actually having a material object in your environment. It requires having access to tissues. So for example, new routines as part of your everyday routine, like checking that you have your keys in your purse and your bag and wallet every morning. And then social distancing, this is the more complex because it depends on other people, on the neighbourhood, on the work situations, travel options, etc. So for example, negotiating with people about how to keep social distance comes into play here. So that's something about psychological knowledge. And now I want something to say about psychological skills and some of the work that I've been doing with the WHO Behavioural Insights team, which is translating large amounts of complex data that are circulated around the WHO regional offices into recommendations. So countries have access to large amounts of survey data, but the countries are very different in their resources available to them to be able to interpret that data or to translate it into actionable recommendations. And that's where psychological skills and behavioural insights can come into play. WHO is sharing a global survey that is data gathered by an organisation called Kantar. It's the COVID-19 National Barometer. But the question is, are countries able to, and are they in fact, translating the nuggets of evidence that are lurking in these large complex data sets into policy and practice? And this is what I was asked to come and help with. So how do we make these large amounts of data usable and useful? Absolutely key. We drew on a simple model of behaviour, which is called Combi, and Combi stands for C for capability, O for opportunity, M for motivation, B for behaviour. And this is probably the simplest but most comprehensive model of behaviour there is. And the basis of it is that no behaviour will happen if there's not the capability, both the physical and also the psychological capability of having skills and knowledge. But also, one can have the capability, but the behaviour won't happen if you're not also motivated, both the top-down conscious bit of one's motivation, but also the more automatic motivation of habits and emotions. But one can have the capability, one can have the motivation, and still the behaviour won't happen if you don't have the opportunity. For example, in my last example, if you don't have the tissues on you, however much you know that you should be sneezing into a tissue and however motivated you are to do it, it won't happen. If you want to know more about this model, it forms part of the hub of a much larger framework called the Behaviour Change Wheel that links this way of understanding behaviour with its interacting loops here and linking it to the kind of intervention strategies and the kind of policies that will be most likely to be effective for the particular behaviour in its particular context. So the work with WHO involved developing a template to help countries and use the messages that are lurking within this complex data. So we have extracted the key messages, we've organised the messages into coherent categories using the CombiConvey model of behaviour, and then translated those into actionable policies. And I want to show you just a small part of the template we've developed that we're now populating with data from the surveys that come in and sharing with all the many countries around the world who have access to the global data survey. So we're looking at how is the population feeling, their concerns, their anxieties, their thinking, their knowledge, their risk perception, and their behaviour, their health, their behaviours in relation to health, their relation in terms of media, etc. To what extent is the population adhering to guidance? And also, what are the influences on adherence in terms of capability, opportunity, and motivation? Because that can steer you in the direction of what type of intervention to develop. So I've just taken a tiny bit of an excerpt from one of the surveys from Brazil, and I'm just going to illustrate it with just a couple of items from the data we're able to extract that concerned feelings, people's emotions. So I hope it's large enough for you to see, but if you look at the top here, we have the columns. So first of all, how is the population? And we have feeling 1, feeling 2. So we extract any finding that is to do with emotion. We say what the finding is. We then say something about the context and the interpretation of that finding. And then finally, how we can apply that finding to action points. So the first one on this survey was that Brazilians have relatively low levels of concern around health. And the context that we're suggesting is that the country leadership have been consistently underplaying the severity of the virus. And so the action point for that is to communicate the severity of the pandemic using trustworthy sources about deaths, overpowering the health services, and future the economy and quality of life in Brazil. So to bring all these kinds of concepts into play, to really try and increase the levels of concern that the population have. And for the sake of time, I won't go on to the second one, but this was around concern around the economic stability of the country. But as I showed you before, this is only one small part of this template, but it gives you an idea of how we're taking this very complex data and making it accessible to countries. This part is part of the template that looks at adherence, and at the top you can see that we've got the capability, the motivation, and the opportunity, and the action points at the bottom are the kind of things one can do to increase capability or to increase motivation or increase opportunity. So this is in relation to hand washing. So for capability, it's using trusted print and digital media sources to maintain awareness of the importance of personal protective behaviours and to demonstrate good practice. For motivation, it's to appeal to feelings around being prepared, social norms, and feelings around disgust regarding the majority adhering to hand washing guidance. And opportunity, ensuring the supply chains of soap and hand sanitizer are clear and that they're available when needed, and ensure that hand washing facilities are available for all when needed. So all of these things need to be in place for the maximum effectiveness of these interventions. And you can see that if you put everything together from the template where we've drilled down into the individual findings, one can then add these into much larger intervention strategies and policies. So to finish with the incredibly important theme of this meeting about building bridges within and across nations, the key that I, and I'm sure everybody else in this panel will be emphasizing, is that people, communities and countries are interconnected. Solutions need to be collaborative, learning from and supporting each other. Psychology has a central role to play in understanding and in changing behaviour. And psychologists have a responsibility to make their expertise useful and usable across communities and across borders. So important to share both our scientific expertise, but also examples of good practice of applying such expertise. And finally, to share with you my strong belief that another world is possible, and also, as I think we're all seeing now, is necessary. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mickey. I appreciate your efforts, your research, your thinking, and the great information that you've given us. We're now going to go into another part of this first panel presentation, and that's the response to the questions. If Dr. Mickey and Dr. Mahadam would come back onto screen, I have some questions to ask you that have just come through. Great, wonderful. Okay, first question that came through is for Dr. Mahadam. As the autocratic regimes are rising around the globe, how crucial is the mindset of people who are living in the subcontinent, and how do we change their mentalities about minorities?
Well, that's an excellent question. Changing the attitudes of authorities towards minorities really does require international cooperation. And one of the themes I touched on was the emphasis on human commonalities rather than differences. And I believe psychological science has made some headway now in demonstrating that we have considerable commonalities across cultures, across groups. I know the emphasis has always traditionally been on group differences, but genetically, psychologically, I would emphasize similarities, and I would emphasize presenting governments with evidence, more and more evidence, on human commonalities rather than dissimilarities. Thank you.
I love the term that you used, omniculturalism. Is there a way of teaching that within psychology courses?
Well, I believe we are already teaching that, in the sense that if we go to any introductory psychology text that we use in our introductory courses, we discuss human commonalities. There are certain differences that are important, but across male-female groups, across ethnic groups, across all types of groups, what we do find is that there is huge overlap. For political reasons, people have emphasized differences, but I believe that we should shift to human commonalities, coming back to the theme of Dr. Mickey, that another world, a better world is possible, and in that world, humanity would be emphasized and our shared characteristics.
Great, thank you. Another question I think was probably be for both of you, and it's a kind of a general question. What is the role of psychology in the recovery from pandemics? Dr. Mickey, you want to try that first?
I think starting with what the challenges are going to be, they're at many different levels. I think there are going to be huge economic and financial challenges. I think there's going to be displacement and housing challenges. And these need to be recognized and dealt with at a material level, but also people to have the kind of support through their communities to deal with these, what will for some people be crises. One of the things that has come out through the pandemic and does come out through crises is the incredible collective solidarity of human beings with each other, incredible acts of generosity and of altruism. And I think coming forward from that, I think that psychologists can play a very strong role in recognizing and supporting and giving opportunities for that. In terms of the problems, there have been substantial mental health rises in mental health problems over the various ways in which the world has experienced the pandemic. That's a very obvious role. Children have lost out on education and development through social relationships. But if I could just maybe end on a positive note for psychology and behavioural scientists, as it was touched on at the beginning, we have got used to a different way of working, which doesn't require hours of commuting every day, which is not good for the planet and it's not good for mental and physical health. And I think there's ways in which we can hang on to some of this, not that we'll be isolated in our homes, but that hopefully we can have hubs, neighbourhood locality hubs, where we can spend some of the time working, which can have communal cafes and events, and really begin to regenerate communities that are so good for social cohesion, social well-being, and indeed for the environment. So I think there's ways in which psychologists play a role both to mitigate a lot of very negative impacts, but also can harness the positive opportunities.
Right. Dr. Moghadam, comment on that? Or
I would just emphasize what Dr. Mickey ended with, that we have the opportunity to build on some of the behavioral changes that are for the positive. Yes.
Very good. And you mentioned mental health, and the next question that came in has to do with that. What are the steps the UN? Yes.
For the sake of time, what we're going to do is cut down on this part of the Q&A, move to the second panel, and then have it back for all the panelists to respond.
Very good. We'll be back to you with more questions.
Yes,
Thank you. We'll turn it over to Dr. Akbar at this point. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. We are now going to enter into the second part of our panelists. I have the distinguished pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Michelle Gelf. Dr. Galfond is a distinguished university professor at the University of Maryland in College Park. She uses field, experimental, and computational neuroscience methods to understand the evolution of culture and its multi-level consequences. Her work has been published in numerous outlets such as Psychological Sciences, The Nature of Human Behavior, and the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. You can see her groundbreaking debut book on the shelves, Rule Breakers, How Tight and Loose Cultures Wire the World, which was published in 2018. Of course, Dr. Galfond has many prestigious awards, has membership into many psychological associations, and I am so delighted to invite her as a thought leader, as a dynamic speaker, as a caring and compassionate scientist that is committed to advancing her work. Dr. Galfond, please introduce your work.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be on this panel. And I think many of us are very much puzzled by the rise in nationalist movements all around the world and dangerous trends of rising intolerance. Many of us, scientists, policymakers, lay people alike, are wondering what is the sudden global appetite for power-hungry leaders who thrive on out-group derogation. And really, the question is, if people around the world see these leaders as the solution, what do they regard as the problem? Now, many explanations have been offered. Rich versus poor, red versus blue in my own country, rural versus urban. And these are all very important factors. But I want to talk about a deeper cultural fault line that I think is being activated and driving some of these dynamics. And once we understand its logic, we'll be in a better position to counteract these movements. And it relates to the desire for certain cultural codes that switch when people feel threatened. And it's what is referred to as the difference between tight and loose cultures. This was a distinction that was first introduced by Pietro Pelto in the late 60s and elaborated upon by John Berry and his colleagues, and later my mentor, Harry Triandis. And it refers to groups that veer tight in the sense that they like strong norms and punishments for people who deviate from rules. Loose cultures have weaker norms and they're more permissive. And our research over the last several decades has shown that threat underlies many of these differences across groups. Groups that tend to have a lot of threat from Mother Nature, think chronic famine or natural disasters, or groups that have a lot of human-made threat, think chronic invasions on your soil, or pathogen outbreaks, or population density, tend to veer tight as compared to groups that have less threat. And the logic is that when we have a lot of collective threat, we need strong rules to coordinate to survive. And we looked at this distinction in a paper we published a few years ago in the journal Science. And you can see from this slide that countries that had a very high population density, as far back as 1500, or experienced chronic natural disasters or food deprivation, those that had a lot of invasions or potential invasions over the last 100 years, and that had a lot of territorial threat, veered tight, as did those that had a high degree of pathogens. And what we can see is that tight and loose confers different advantages to groups depending on your standpoint, your vantage point. Tight cultures tend to have a lot of order. They have lower crime, more uniformity and synchrony, and they have higher self-control or self-regulation. Loose cultures struggle with order, but they corner the market on openness. They have much more tolerance to different people from different races, religions, the stigmatized, and they have higher creativity, and they're more open to new ideas. There's also differences in preferences for leadership in tight and loose cultures. In a paper we published in the Journal of Cross-Cultural Psychology, we studied thousands of managers across the world, and we asked them, what are the leadership behaviors that contribute to being an outstanding leader? And people across the world had very different answers to these questions. In tight cultures, people preferred autonomous, independent leaders. In loose cultures, they preferred charismatic and team-oriented leaders. This distinction of tight and loose is not just limited to the modern era. When we code ethnographies with Carol Ember and Josh Jackson from the Standard Cross-Cultural Sample, we can differentiate cultures in pre-industrial societies in terms of their overall degree of norm strength across many different categories of life, as you see here on the screen. And the same pattern can be found in pre-industrial societies, that those that veered tight tended to have higher degrees of threat. They're from population density, warfare, pathogens, and scarcity. Now, I've been talking about chronic objective threat, but what we see is that actually threats don't need to be real to tighten people up. When we activate threat in the lab, something that we call ecological priming, whether it's activating potential terrorist threats or natural disasters or pathogens, we can see an immediate shift in the desire for tightness and stricter rules. And also we see shifts in the order and openness trade-off in terms of having greater ethnocentrism and preference for autocratic leaders. In election data, we can also see this happening in voters' minds. When we measured people's perceived threats in the United States, whether from ISIS or North Korea or perceived threats to immigration, people who felt a lot of threat felt the US was too loose and desired greater tightness. And this impacted prejudice toward outgroups as well as intentions to vote for Donald Trump. We also see this in other election dynamics, for example, in France as well on the lower part of this screen. But also we know that leaders also take advantage of this tight psychology. They tend to use a lot of threatening language and target people who already feel threatened in order to gain popularity. What we can see is that, in a sense, autocrats and other leaders hijack this psychology, and threat constitutes the foundation of their narratives. And you can see this in just a couple of different examples. Salvini saying, we're under attack, our culture, society, traditions, and their way of life are at risk. In Hungary, Orban said Hungarians have to get rid of Muslim invaders. And the goal of these narratives is to inspire fear in tightened groups and be seen as the only person who can deliver safety. As Trump has said many times, I alone can fix it. We can start to try to quantify this through dictionaries on threat. So in our culture group at the University of Maryland, with my students, we have developed a new threat dictionary using Glove's vector representations of words mapped in a corpus. By being able to look through Wikipedia, Twitter, and Common Crawl, we can seed words that actually reflect a large degree of threat. Then we can use these kinds of dictionaries to track threat over time and see its influence on populations. So for example, here are some dictionary words that come from this corpus. And we can analyze and see, in fact, that leaders like Trump in his 2016 campaign speeches used a lot more threatening words as compared to Hillary Clinton. We can also see with other data how uptakes in threat is tightening populations. So for example, we can analyze through newspapers.com over the last 100 years, the amount of threatening languages in newspapers, and we can correlate that with other data, for example, the General Social Survey. And we see that the degree to which newspapers have a lot of threatening language is related to attitudes as expressed, prejudiced against different groups on the GSS. This leads me to implications of how we can think about dealing with the roots of populism. It's not really something that is just being driven by some kind of historical moment of charismatic leaders. We need to think about how we can deal with the threat that drives the desire for tightness. Some of this threat is objective. We need to empathize with people who have been displaced for so many different reasons. For example, with the rise of AI, many have lost manufacturing jobs that were at the cornerstone of their communities. And we need to develop partnerships across the government, local organizations, and schools to retrain people for jobs that will be prevalent in the 21st century. We also have to deal with exaggerated threat, fake threat, of course, in this new era of conspiracy theories. We know from our own data that people overestimate by a large extent the number of illegal immigrants in the United States, and that's driving, in turn, their desire for stricter rules and autocratic leaders. And to Fatali's point, we need to also develop mechanisms to help reduce prejudice, to help people understand the other. We know that people are occupying their own different echo chambers, and we need to create spaces for meaningful interactions for people on and offline. And this is very difficult because often people, for example, across cultures, meet in the media. They watch each other's movies and they see very stereotypical examples of behavior, and they start influencing their own attitudes toward those cultures. So I want to end on just a technique that we've been developing in our group to try to create those spaces We can't easily fly people from around the world to actually come into contact with each other, but we can actually expose them to aspects of their lives. And actually, this relates to something that Fatali mentioned, is that these methods can also help people understand each other, but they can also help them understand their similarities. We did this with something we call a new daily diary technique. We collected daily diaries in the US and Pakistan for 7 days. And then we randomly assigned people from the US and Pakistan to read each other's diaries or to read people's diaries from their own homelands for 7 days. And over time, we were measuring cultural distance and how stereotypes were being changed over time. At the start of this study, we saw that Americans perceived Pakistanis as not just tight, but extraordinarily tight. And they didn't envision Pakistanis in context apart from mosques. They didn't envision them playing sports or reading poetry. Pakistanis likewise envisioned Americans to be loose, but extraordinarily loose. They thought Americans sometimes were half naked and calling the police on their parents for being too strict. They didn't envision Americans in contexts that were more strict, like in workplace settings or being formal in other contexts, or eating dinner with their families. So by collecting these diaries and not having them edited, we wanted to expose people to the actual lives of other people. So you can see here in the example of the diaries what Americans might have read, or other Pakistanis. You see at home, for this particular participant, the day started as usual. Woke up to say my prayer, recited the whole Quran. It was a pleasant morning. Later, another entry from this diary was at the university that a learned speaker was coming, and the whole class was excited, and they decorated the Jamia and arranged special seating. And then again at home later, lying down, going to sleep, and thinking about the lecture. You can see an American diary entry. Again, unedited. I woke up a little bit late for work, but it ended up being okay. I was working with one of my coworkers that I get along so well with, and it was enjoyable. Later at a bar, I met my parents at my sister's work. We sat at the bar and chatted. It was great to see them. We had a really great time, and I was able to relax since my class was over. And then later, my boyfriend came over to my house, and we invited some of our friends, and we watched South Park, and we had a few beers. So what we really wanted to see is, being exposed to people's actual lives, in fact, their stereotypes, does it reduce cultural distance? Does it increase cultural empathy? And that's exactly what we found. We found that Pakistanis did see Americans as being looser than their culture, and vice versa. But they actually wound up seeing much less distance, more similarities than differences. And this affected their perceptions of Americans. Through this intervention, we can see that they started to see Americans as having higher morality and less arrogance. And likewise, Americans started to see that Pakistanis were tight, but they had much more freedom than they realized. And they saw them as much warmer. So this is just to suggest that we can think about cultural differences and empathize with where they come from in an ecological historical context. But we can also, as Fatali mentioned, emphasize similarities within the context of these differences. And that's what Harry Triandis, my mentor who passed away last year, always emphasized in cross-cultural psychology. I won't have time to get into how tight loose is impacting the corona epidemic, but I'd be happy to talk through what's happening in our data in terms of the shift to tightening and the optimal responses in early parts of the pandemic. And for anyone that's interested, a lot of this work is summarized in my book, Rule Makers, Rule Breakers, How Tight and Loose Cultures Wire Our World. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gaffan. That was amazing and very, very important work. Now I'm going to move on to introduce Dr. Sarah Lyons-Padilla, who is a social psychologist by training, a researcher, a consultant, and a dynamic person that continues to explore the psychological foundations of radicalization among Muslims with immigrant backgrounds in the United States and in Germany. Dr. Padilla received her bachelor's degree from psychology from the University of Virginia and her PhD in social decision-making and organizational sciences from the University of Maryland, where she was involved with the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism. I am so thrilled to hear the research that Dr. Lyons-Padilla is going to present to you today, because what I have observed is that she is herself an observer of trends. She is a collaborator, a social scientist, and a change agent. and I'm eager to have her present on discrimination and the risk of radicalization. Dr. Padilla, Alliance Padilla.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for the opportunity to participate in this panel today. So I'm going to be talking about some research that I conducted with Dr. Michelle Gelfand, who you just heard from, when I was at the University of Maryland as her PhD student. And this research touches on one of the themes today being anti-immigrant sentiment. And when we embarked on this project, there had been a number of violent attacks on American soil that were committed in the name of Islam and making headlines. What was particularly puzzling about some of these attacks is that the perpetrators were not coming in from the outside. They were actually immigrants living in the US or born and bred US citizens whose parents may have been immigrants. And there were several attacks like these that were sponsored or inspired by the Islamic State. And even before the Islamic State was on our radar, there were attacks like the Boston Marathon bombings, which were committed by a pair of brothers who had moved to the US as children. And we wanted to understand what would make someone turn to extremism, and in particular, what would make someone aggress against the country that they called home. And so there are some common misconceptions about radicalization that would-be terrorists are inherently bad in some way. They're violent people who are psychologically unstable, they're criminals, or in the case of religiously motivated extremism, there may be an assumption that people who become radicalized are extremely religious to begin with. But in fact, there is no clear personality profile that makes someone become radicalized. Many before me have extensively studied radicalization, including people on this panel, Dr. Gelfand and Dr. Mukarram. And a number of theories point to the notion that people on the trajectory to radicalization are struggling with some sort of identity conflict. And a body of work by the psychologist Ari Kuklinski suggests that would-be extremists are looking to find a sense of significance or a feeling that they matter. People can feel threats to significance in a number of ways, including humiliation and discrimination. And as we know, Muslims around the globe have experienced significant discrimination in the post 9/11 era. And so we might expect that discrimination could be a source of significance loss for some young Muslims. One key source of significance is the feeling that we belong, that other people care about us and value us. And extremist groups are very good at exploiting this very fundamental human need. The Islamic State was actively recruiting young Muslims in the West, crafting this narrative that carrying out attacks on their behalf would offer them status, purpose, and a sense of belonging. And indeed, this message did seem to find appeal for some. This right here is a tweet from a young woman from the West who appears to have found that sense of belonging in the Islamic State, despite all the clear dangers associated with it. But of course, the vast majority of people would reject extremist calls for recruitment. So what would make some people more vulnerable than others? As I was saying, belonging is a key source of significance, and that sense of belonging comes from the many different social identities that we hold, including our cultural identities, which give us a sense of certainty about who we are and where we come from. People with immigrant backgrounds are navigating multiple cultural identities, and so Dr. Gelfand and I decided to explore the role of cultural identities in radicalization. I'll briefly go through the psychologist Dr. John Barry's acculturation framework, which guided this research. It reflects two dimensions: how much immigrants feel connected to their heritage culture and how much they feel connected to the larger society. Immigrants who feel well connected to both their heritage culture and the larger society are said to be integrated, and a large body of work has shown that integration is associated with better health and well-being. Immigrants who feel strongly tethered to their heritage culture, but not the larger society, are said to be separated, while those who feel primarily a sense of connection to the larger society, but not their heritage culture, are said to be assimilated. Both of these acculturation orientations come with benefits and drawbacks. On the one hand, strong identification with one cultural group, but then disconnection from another. But then there are also some immigrants who feel neither connected to their heritage culture nor the larger society, who are said to be marginalized. In a way, they feel what we say is culturally homeless or caught between worlds. We thought that feelings of cultural homelessness might generate a sense of significance loss for some young Muslims with immigrant backgrounds, not having the sense of connection afforded by either of their cultural identities. And in addition, we thought that the culturally homeless might be more vulnerable to other significance threatening experiences, such as discrimination, as I mentioned earlier. So this is what we set out to test in our research. In partnership with local community organizations, we conducted interviews with Muslims in the United States and in Germany to understand their experiences living as religious and cultural minorities. We decided to explore Germany as an additional setting where extremism in the name of Islam is also a concern, but where there's a very different local cultural context in the US. Germany is relatively tight in comparison to the US, and thanks to Dr. Gelfand giving her talk before me, I don't need a slide to introduce tightness looseness. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So these interviews we conducted help us extract insights that informed the design of an online survey that we could administer in both countries. Our participants were young Muslims who were either immigrants themselves or who were the children of immigrants. In the survey, we set out to understand the connection between cultural identities, discrimination, significance loss, and support for extremism. And support for extremism was reflected in questions we asked about support for extremist groups, ideologies, and behaviors. And so I'll start by reviewing what we found in our American survey. First of all, as would be expected, overall support for extremism was very low. But we did find that feeling threats to one's sense of significance was associated with all of our indicators of support for extremism. The more participants felt some lack of significance in their lives, the more appeal they found in extremist groups, ideologies, and behaviors. So the next question was, who was likely to feel this lack of significance? As we'd predicted, feelings of cultural homelessness were associated with these threats to significance. And notably, the other cultural orientations that I described earlier were not predictors of significance loss. And in fact, integration was associated with a greater sense of significance. We also found that discrimination was associated with threats to significance. And moreover, that relationship between discrimination and significance loss was even stronger for people who already felt culturally homeless. The more culturally homeless they felt, the more discrimination cut to the core of their sense of self-worth. We think that this is because people who feel a connection to some cultural identity are partially buffered against the harms of discrimination due to the sense of belongingness that these cultural identities afford them. They know they belong somewhere. But people who feel culturally homeless are particularly vulnerable to the damaging effects of discrimination. And so there are a few implications here. First, some might assume that young Muslims who feel strongly identified with their heritage cultural identities would be most at risk for radicalization, but our results suggest otherwise. And in fact, they suggest that heritage cultural identities are actually a crucial part of cultivating a sense of significance. It's those who feel culturally homeless who need reassurance that they matter. And second, integration revealed itself to be a productive factor. In fact, we saw that integration interacted with discrimination in exactly the opposite way as cultural homelessness. The more integrated participants felt, the less discrimination was associated with significance loss. We also conducted some exploratory comparisons between our American and German samples to better understand the role of the larger society in acculturation and radicalization processes. We found that there was stronger support for extremism among our German Muslim participants. And we found that this was partially explained by cultural tightness, as you just heard about in Dr. Gelfand's talk. Muslim participants in Germany felt that their society was comparatively tighter than Americans. And these perceptions of tightness were associated with the belief the larger society was closed-minded towards cultural diversity. These beliefs, in turn, predicted lower integration in among German participants, and lower integration in turn was associated with stronger support for extremism. And so this is telling us that the success of immigrants' integration is largely constrained by the attitudes of the larger society, which are influenced by broad cultural dimensions like tightness and looseness. And tightness and looseness may have downstream implications not only for integration, but also for support for extremism. And so I'll go through some takeaways of this research. We've seen in recent years political leaders spreading anti-Muslim sentiment, both in their words and in their policies, supposedly aimed at reducing the threat of violent extremism. But our results suggest that this rhetoric is not only threatening the safety and well-being of Muslim communities around the globe, but is also counterproductive. Denying Muslims a space to embrace their own cultural identities and feel connected to the larger society is actually likely to produce the psychological conditions that increase the appeal of extremist groups' narratives. And as well, our results reinforce the importance of promoting integration, which is not the same as assimilation. Integration is what we should be striving for, as it allows immigrants to feel like they can keep a foot in both worlds. We must be careful of integration programs that are actually assimilation programs that force immigrants to adopt the identity of the larger society while checking their own cultural identities at the door. And as refugees flee unsafe conditions around the globe, our research also speaks to the importance of investing in refugees' integration throughout the resettlement process. Finally, our work in Germany highlights the importance of understanding the role of the local cultural context, as there's not a single one-size-fits-all solution to preventing extremism or facilitating integration. And so I'll end on a couple of recommendations. First, it's crucial that policymakers partner with academics to develop and evaluate programs that at once facilitate integration and counter radicalization. And second, in recent years, we've seen the rise of extremist groups, not consisting of immigrants, but in fact fueled by anti-immigrant sentiment. And so we need to explore how the relationship between cultural homelessness, significance loss, and extremism may manifest outside religious and ethnic minority communities. A lot of research has been invested in understanding violent extremism in the name of Islam, but as white nationalists and other such extremist ideologies take hold, we need to understand how to counter these movements too. And so thank you so much for your attention. I want to say thank you to Michelle as my fearless PhD advisor and to our research collaborators and supporters.
Dr. Lyons-Padilla, Dr. Gelfand, we are so appreciative to have you here. And we're going to start with the first question, which is probably going to be a mixture of both of your research. And I know that they're very interconnected, so this might be sort of like the culmination moment. Here we go. How does the research around increased discrimination and this idea of the framework around leading to radicalization apply to various cultural groups in the US that are struggling with a sense of belongingness in this divisive political climate? And I'm going to go through the various cultural groups and some of the current stressors that they may be experiencing. So for example, with the African American community, fresh wounds that just have opened this past week around the Christian Cooper incident in Central Park and the George Floyd incident in Minneapolis. And so we're looking at discrimination, discriminatory practices, and I want you to keep in mind sort of this idea of the leading or increasing of the thought process of radicalization. For Latino or other immigrants, the anti-immigrant sentiments. For indigenous cultures, oppressive tribal systems. For the AAPI culture, COVID and the targeting of Asian Americans around exposing and bringing COVID to light and, and essentially spreading the disease. And of course, you've talked at length for the Muslim community in the idea of Islamophobia. So how do we take this framework and how do we explain that domestically here in the US? You're muted. Yep.
Sarah, you want to talk first, or this applies really to radicalization, so maybe you want to kind of comment, and I can comment after too.
Sure. I mean, certainly discrimination and mistreatment in all of the scenarios you described is likely to engender these feelings of significance loss that we described in the context of radicalization. Of course, significance loss does not always directly lead to extremism. There are, in the context I was discussing earlier, there are existing structures and ideologies and groups and extremist leaders who are exploiting these threats to significance in order to recruit people. Of course, there are different ways that people find ways to restore significance in different ways, but of course, in the example that you described, certainly the ongoing discrimination and violence against unarmed Black men in the United States is something that is extremely severe and like a collective trauma that involves anyone who feels a connection to those being victimized. And I'm not sure if I can comment explicitly on how this is related to radicalization, but I think it speaks to movements that have organized around these injustices, where people have found a sense of purpose in seeking justice and countering these injustices. And maybe Michelle has more to offer on that.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question, that there seems to be a mutual kind of tightening among groups. And I think when there's discrimination and when there's attacks, and what we need really are strong local leaders. We need to all stand up and help groups to de-radicalize and to stop having such horrendous blame of each other. One example of this was in Iowa, when there was a jogger that was killed by an immigrant. Her father stood up and said, "Do not blame immigrants. This is not based on immigration status. It's not based on ethnicity. It's based on hate." And we need our local leaders, we need our presidents, we need our governments to stand up to this hate. And I think collectively as psychologists, we're trying to produce research that can help people understand and not stereotype people based on these kinds of superficial characteristics. So I think it is time for us to really try to organize more outreach in helping people to stop blaming others based on faulty characteristics.
As a follow-up to that comment, both of your comments, how do you position the conversation for white allyship? In saying exactly what you said, and instead of, let's say, that father stating that, how can allyship speak that louder, and so that it can be heard within the cultural group that they're representing?
Yeah, I think it's the $1 million question, and I'll get back to the idea that Fathali mentioned, which is this unity. I can't remember the term, but that we help people understand that they're more similar than they think. We've seen this in many different, not many, but spaces where we bring people together who had really negative views of each other in a safe place, and we give them time to get to understand their similarities, to empathize with their perspectives. To Sarah's point, a lot of people stereotype immigrants as not wanting to integrate, and that's not what she found. A lot of people stereotype immigrants in the United States as being loose, as coming from contexts that are going to threaten the fabric of the country, when in fact, research in economics suggests that immigrants are more rule-abiding. And in contexts where there are a lot of immigrants, actually their schools work even better. So I think part of this is getting people in these spaces, getting thought leaders to bring people together and to help to counter these stereotypes. Because misinformation is really the weapon that is fueling a lot of this.
And I think, piggybacking off of what you said in terms of the anti-immigrant sentiments, when we are in such a divisive political and societal climate at this time, and the way that asylum seekers and immigrants are being treated is, being put in border camps and dehumanized and treated in ways that the message, right, the global message is that they're not worth it. That sense of belonging that you both author about, that othering, is emphasized over and over again. And so how can immigrants feel that they are part of this society? How do we tighten that looseness so that it is, there's identification with the idealism of American, right? Which is what most immigrants just want to do. They want to be part of this society. They want to work. They want to contribute. They want to be upstanding citizens. The data shows that over and over again. What advice would you have? What recommendations would you have around that? Sarah, unmute.
One challenge also addressing the previous question. Oh, sorry. Is that in the delicate balance between celebrating difference and emphasizing similarity is also recognizing very real power differentials and systematic systems of oppression that make it difficult for people in low power positions like immigrants and refugees to demonstrate to their that they want to integrate, but also on their own terms. And so it's important to recognize who controls the narrative about what it means to be American and what it means to be similar to one another. And so speaking to your question about allyship, I think that those of us who are in a position of privilege from historically having been in the position that we are part of the group that controls these narratives, you need to be recognize us and be able to step back and leave space for others to be a part of that conversation about what it means to be American and what it means to integrate and change what that American identity is.
Thank you for acknowledging that. I have a question that's coming in from India.
Great.
The question is,
could we bring Dr. Mohan
yes,
and Dr. Mickey?
Absolutely. Let's do that. And perhaps
could we bring them back into the conversation?
Yes, Walter.
Time, please. Dr. Mohan and Dr.
Do you
Mickey.
want to?
Good. Okay, we're all back here. Great. Okay. Well, go ahead. I have some questions left over from before, but you were in the middle of a question. Go ahead.
So the question is coming from India. The majority is threatened by the very presence of minority. No opportunity to demonize minority is left out to the extent that they were blamed for the spread of COVID. What strategy could the minority use to loosen stereotypes that the majority hold onto in such scenario? Michelle?
Yeah, this is something that's a really very devastating situation in the sense that we know that in a sense groups do need to become tighter to deal with the threat in terms of having stricter rules around hand washing and around social distancing and all the things that Susan talked about. But we also have to deal with the fact that the same psychology that facilitates rule following also can lead to ethnocentrism and increased stereotyping and prejudice. And that's where we need to be what I call ambidextrous around and mindful of norms. We need to negotiate culture in ways that we are simultaneously tightening up when we need to, but maintaining the kind of tolerance and looseness that goes along with those types of codes. And I think that we need to talk about these things as psychologists. I think we need to really be using research to try to help people understand that kind of ambidexterity. And so I think we have a big role in trying to help people to understand that risk.
And human behavior, correct? Walter? Oh.
Right.
I mean,
could I add to that?
Go ahead.
I think two other things that are really important is not only telling people what the rules are and what they should do, but provide the rationale and explain why these rules are in place and what the consequences of doing or not doing the rules are. And the other thing that I think is so important is the concept of co-creation of these rules, that there's proper partnership, working in communities together and bringing different communities together to think about the problem, how best to solve them. And so everybody has collective ownership of the rules.
Yeah, I'll just mention that, in my own country, which is kind of an uncoordinated mess.
A question there came in.
Oh, sorry, Walter. Oh, we can't hear you.
I think the sound keeps going. Go ahead. You were in the middle of saying something. I didn't mean to cut.
I was just thinking, to Susan's point, that what we find is that in general, like in our computational models and other work, that when there's a collective threat, people start to really follow rules more. But when we have governments who are reducing the intensity or conflicted about the threat, then people can have kind of an evolutionary mismatch, and they can rebel against rules that are very important for their communities. And today in the conversation piece, I talked about how we need to be calibrated in communities and have empathy. Some places don't have a lot of threat, and it makes sense to loosen in those contexts, but some places have a lot of threat, including my own county in PG County, Maryland, where we need to tighten up. And I think, Susan, to your point, we need to be able to help people who don't like to sacrifice liberty for constraint with understanding why these rules are important. We need to appeal to their own moral foundations to be able to be persuasive for the betterment of all.
Can you hear me at this point?
Walter, unmute. Yeah.
Can you hear me at this point?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Okay. Someone raised a question that's relevant to this.
Yes.
Are there research findings that highlight cultural variations in the effectiveness of interventions to change behavior relative to COVID-19? I am met with silence. Did you hear me?
I think,
you want to pick someone?
This is a very important question. I think that it's just incredibly empowering to see the amount of research going on during such a stressful and terrible time. I think people are working around the clock to try on so many different dimensions to understand how to facilitate better health, less stereotyping. I don't know of any work directly on ethnocentrism and COVID, but I do know that we're trying to track it with our threat dictionary on Twitter to see what's happening. Where do we see groups feeling threat, and also starting to get very ethnocentric? And I think a lot of work now will need to be done online to try to de-stereotype people. It's no longer the contact hypothesis in the laboratory. We need to deal with online hate in a really big way. We need to partner with computer scientists, with lots of people from different disciplines in order to figure out where is that hate, where is that prejudice, and how can we counteract it. I've seen some work where people are using bots, artificial bots, to try to take on people who are stereotyping and who are very prejudicial with some success. And I think we'll see much more of that work in the future.
Very nice.
Wonderful.
Yes, go ahead. Ollie?
Unmute.
Let me add something here.
Oh, you have to unmute.
Returning to the theme. Oh, sorry.
There you go.
Oh, no,
I'm not able to unmute.
There we go.
Okay.
Difficulty there. Ollie, can you? No.
Yes, have I unmuted?
I'm going to move to the next question.
Yeah.
There you go. Yes, yes, yes.
Okay. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a response? I'm going to move to the next question. Please hold your thought, and then hopefully we can get your mic taken care of.
Okay.
Okay. The next. Oh, go ahead.
This is for Dr. Mickey, but I think for the rest of the panel as well. Given the difference in the mortality rate in Black and ethnic minorities, how can psychologists and behavioral psychologists address the determinants of health inequalities in this world?
Susan, unmute.
The issue of inequalities is incredibly important. No?
Now
we hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can.
Good. The issue of inequality is incredibly important. Most of us are from societies that are extremely unequal. When COVID-19 happened, the restrictions that have been put in place have further exacerbated the inequalities, such that people who are already on low incomes or in financial precarious situations became even more precarious, and those who were living in very overcrowded accommodation suffered more than others by the restrictions. And increasingly, there's been evidence about people from Black and ethnic minority communities, first of all, getting the disease more frequently, and also having severer consequences as a result of the disease. And research is beginning, but desperately needed, to look to see to what extent are these social factors, which is that many people who are on the front line of health and social care, of retail and delivery, have been Black and ethnic minority citizens, and also multi-generational overcrowded houses as a result of poverty, as a result of inequalities. So there's a whole series of social issues that need to be looked at before one looks at any cultural, behavioural, social interaction issues. So there's a big agenda there, an incredibly important agenda to look at.
Very good.
Anyone else?
Yes.
I'll just mention that some of our research would suggest that women, minorities, people of low power, as Sarah alluded to, live in tighter worlds. They're held to stricter standards. We're seeing already some evidence that there's more negative reaction to people who are violating health norms who come from these kinds of lower power communities. And we need to be really mindful that not only do we have these terrible health disparities, but we also have double standards for who we punish under what situations. So I think that issues of stigma really need to be dealt with in the coming months to help these groups to be dealing with health and sociocultural types of issues.
Many researchers have said that racism is now considered a pre-existing condition, and that in terms of a public health epidemic, the underlying conditions by which racism perpetuates these health disparities is tremendous. Any thoughts about that, panel?
Well, I think that racism is very important, but we should also keep in mind resource inequalities. One of the issues that I think Dr. Mickey and others have alluded to is this problem of the bottom group. And of course, all the data tells us that resource inequalities are increasing. The bottom group across the world is falling further behind, relatively further behind. And so this is part of the commonalities I was alluding to. Human beings really are very similar to each other across societies in the trends that are characterizing societies. Resource inequalities, greater and greater resource concentration in fewer and fewer hands. Those are some of the commonalities I would refer to.
Very good. Okay, I think we're moving toward the conclusion of our time. And I'd just like to take a couple of minutes to kind of summarize my perceptions and my sense of this wonderful session that we had.
Walter, we've been given a few more minutes, and there were two very pressing questions that wanted to come through before we concluded. One is a really sort of dovetailing right after Ali's comment, and it would be, how do we create a society where diversity, racial, cultural, religious differences are not weaponized? Where do we begin to create a society that is not just tolerant, but where we increase cultural empathy?
I don't want to answer that question. I'll let somebody else answer, but I object to the term race being used in this kind of discussion. This is a complete myth. There are no racial genetic differences across the groups being referred to.
I would just say that any broad differences that we're trying to understand and help people to celebrate diversity, we have to start with ourselves. Where are we? How are we socialized in terms of our own cultures, because often people forget, like the two fish who are swimming and they pass by another fish who says, you know, hey boys, how's the water? And they swim on and say, what the heck is water? And it's just for the fish, you know, just like humans, we fail to recognize these very omnipresent forces of culture that are affecting us all the time. For fish, that's water, but for humans, that's culture. And I think the first thing we need to do is to help people understand how they've been uniquely socialized to value certain types of things and to abide by certain types of norms, and how perhaps that was functional in that context. I always give the example in cultural empathy when we tell Americans that you can't bring large quantities of gum into Singapore, they think it's preposterous. Like, why would you not allow gum in Singapore? But once you think about, it's a very highly population density context. There's 20,000 people per mile, and gum was causing a lot of problems with a lot of mouths per capita in that context. People were throwing gum on the ground, and it was blocking sensors on buses and on elevators and trains, and they banned the tasty treat for reasons. Not all cultural differences amount to these kinds of functionalities, but once we can empathize where these differences come from, how we, if we lived in those contexts, might also think the same way. To follow Fethela's point, understanding both similarities and differences, I think, is really important in starting from your sense of self, first and foremost.
Last question to close it up, and then I'll hand it over to Walter, has to do with cultural homelessness and recommendations for the UN. The recommendations for the 193 member states that deal often with these issues from a social policy perspective, the idea of xenophobia, anti-migration, and these other types of sentiments. How can psychologists begin to support the idea of cultural homelessness or cultural integration in one way or another? So Dr. Lyons Padilla, if you can begin with answering that question, that would be wonderful.
Sure. I think there's a great opportunity for psychologists to become part of discussion around integration in societies around the globe. As I mentioned towards the end of my talk, there are a lot of different terms being tossed around, and we're not all speaking the same language. And so, for example, in Western Europe, there's a lot of talk about integration, but it is not integration in the way that we think of it in psychology, but rather assimilation. And so coming to a common understanding about what integration means and to what extent that reflects embracing the cultural identities that different groups bring to the table, and not just how to adopt to the norms of the larger society is an important place to start.
Any other thoughts on that? Any recommendations to the UN and its member states?
Well, my one recommendation is to focus on commonalities, what I call omniculturalism, and not exaggerate differences, and definitely not bring the term race into the discussion.
Yeah, and I'll just mention that, building on Sarah's point, I think we need to foster a sense of community accountability. We need to have people on the watch out for people who are falling through the cracks, falling through what Sarah called marginalization, people who are not part of any particular group. There are warning signs that we can see. Maybe we can create language dictionaries to try to identify this kind of psychology. And we need, as communities, it takes a village, as they say, to be able to call people out who seem to be really struggling. Whether we create some kind of community watchdogs, I mean, that's not the right word, because it's really meant to help people. And that needs to be done in a bottom-up fashion. And we can try to coordinate. What do those circles look like that are trying to help people who are feeling lost and feeling culturally homeless?
And I'll just add to that, there was a program in Denmark some years back that it was a counter-radicalization program that involved leaders from both the larger Danish society and also Muslim community leaders that work together. So I think that that's an important point, as well as that when building solutions for people who may be at risk for radicalization or other problems via cultural homelessness, to cooperate across groups. It's not the responsibility of one community or another.
We've been given another 15 minutes. Sorry, go ahead, Dr. Mickey. We've been given another 15 minutes.
Oh, gosh.
After Dr. Mickey, I have another provocative question to ask Dr. Mogadam. But go ahead, Dr. Mickey, first.
Just to add to what has been said, the other issue I think is really important is the notion of collective solidarity. I think many of us in our countries have, in different ways, experienced consumerism and individualism and competition. And I think one of the things the pandemic has shown people is the power of collective solidarities when communities work together and work to help each other. And it really has brought out the best in people. And I think that goes a long way in so many different issues, including this one.
Very nice. I have a question from Dr. Mogadam, and it comes from someone in Nepal. I just wanted this person to have the advantage of having this coming so far away for asking the question. And the question is, looking at, since we're living in a world of neoliberalism, is omniculturalism just a word game played by the Western world for the rest of the world? Can you respond to this person from Nepal?
Excellent question. Excellent question. I don't believe focusing on human commonalities is a game played by Western powers or elites. Indeed, if you look at the way multiculturalism functions, I believe it benefits the elites within minorities right now. The only people who really benefit from multiculturalism in Western societies are minority elites who benefit both materially and otherwise. I believe that focusing on commonalities through the UN, emphasizing the ways in which human beings are similar and placing dissimilarity at a second level, I think that is to the benefit of poorer nations and poorer peoples, explaining that all people have fundamental needs. That's a psychological fact. And we need to address basic needs for all people across the world, not just the elites.
Another question that came in that reminds me of this, someone asked the question, does omniculturalism deny the concept of diversity?
No, it doesn't, but it places it at a secondary level. For example, men and women are different, but their commonalities, it seems to me, are more important. The other point I would make is when we look at the progress of women, for example, in education, they did not make this progress by emphasizing their differences with men. They emphasized how they can compete with men as human beings. And that's what I believe minorities, ethnic minorities, should be doing.
I just want to mention that I don't think it has to be either or. These kind of polarities sometimes get us into like trouble. They get us going down the wrong path. I think we can think about emphasizing similarities and differences within the same context. We can understand that we are socialized to have different needs, even based on our ecologies, but we also share a tremendous amount of similarity. And that's what we could see when we had people read each other's diaries. I want to mention that we tried to do this study where we used a contextual priming paradigm. We showed people in Pakistan pictures of Americans in contexts that were more serious, as well as in parties. And we showed Americans pictures of Pakistanis in mosques, but also pictures of them playing sports and reading poetry. And that intervention didn't work at all. People didn't believe that they were actually in these contexts. But once they read each other's diaries, they noted the differences, but they also, to Pathali's point, noted tremendous amounts of similarity. And I think both are really important. I don't think it has to be either or.
Thank you, Michelle, for closing us out with that thought that it doesn't have to be either or, and that polarity may not be the response. I want to hand this over to Walter to thank this dynamic, wonderful panel for this very inquisitive and dynamic discussion. Walter, can you close us out, and then we'll have Leslie and Rashmi join us?
Yes, yes. And I close this out by saying thank you so much to the four magnificent panelists for all that you've done in your careers, in your work, in your research, in your writing, in the things that you've said to the rest of the world. And thank you so much for coming here today to Psychology Day at the United Nations and dealing with this important area, this important document for the world, and sharing this with us. Tremendous and total appreciation. What I've come away with kind of succinctly is that what is now so obvious is the importance of multiculturalism. We need multiculturalism in order to save the United Nations. We must save the United Nations and the multiculturalism approach in order to solve the major issues and the major problems of our world. We see it right now with the epidemic. We see it in terms of climate control. We see it in terms of nuclear proliferation. No country can solve this alone. It has to be a multilateral involvement of all people, from all groups, from all point of views, to make this world continue. We have to do that in order to preserve the world for ourselves and for the generations to come. The other piece that I come away with is the importance of psychology in achieving this. The importance of psychology in helping the UN establish and promote multiculturalism, multilateralism. And we know from our experience at the UN, it is a tough road to hoe to get involved with the UN as an organization and with the 193 nations that comprise the UN. In the last month or so, we have been applauding and recognizing those people who have come to the front line of dealing with this pandemic. And as I'm thinking about the role of psychology, I'm thinking that perhaps we should take a lesson from them, and that perhaps it's time for psychologists, all psychologists, clinical, social, organizational, to take multiculturalism and bring it to the front line of the work that we do in our individual research and practices, and bringing it to the front line of the United Nations as psychologists. And with that, once again, I thank you so much for being here, for all that you've given us, for making this a magnificent couple of hours. And now let me turn it back to my colleagues, Rashmi and Leslie.
Thank you.
Panels, can you remember? Thank you.
Hello again, and thank you. That was really amazing. A lot to think about, very, very substantive talks. I wish we had more time. People whose questions, I'm sure there were so many questions that people didn't had time to get to. So please send your questions to unpsychday@gmail.com, the email on your confirmation email. And send us your questions so that we can try to see if we can get them answered by the speakers. Okay, so I just wanted to say, and Elke, can I have the last slide, please? Elke, last slide. What I want to do is, we want to really encourage the psychology community worldwide listening into this event to reach out to your networks and conduct dialogues to raise awareness on these important issues. Now that we've had such a rich discussion, and you've heard so many interesting kinds of ways to look at these things. So it's a really good way to support the UN75 Global Dialogues Initiative. And so this is sort of kicking off our Psychology Global Dialogues Initiative, this Psychology Day. So if you decide to conduct a dialogue in your community and use the Dialogues Toolkit, let the UN know that you're doing it. and send your feedback to them. And the instructions are on the UN75 website. And you can see on the screen our email address also, unpsychday@gmail.com for any questions. But also the UN75 website is on our Psychology Day website. So you can also find the link there, or you can just Google it. Google UN75 and you'll get it. So if you do host a dialogue, let the UN know and follow the instructions, but also we would really appreciate it if you could let us know if you are going to do a dialogue with your community by emailing it to us at unpsychday@gmail.com, so that we can also be informed of what the dialogues happening in our community are around the world. And so reach out to people who disagree with you. Psychologists know how to have dialogues in non-threatening ways, and we work to build peace and harmony within individuals, families, communities, countries, and between countries. So let's use our skills and join in and become a part of the global dialogue. Thank you, and over to you, Leslie.
Okay. On behalf of the Psychology Coalition at the United Nations, I would like to thank our incredible panel of experts for sharing their knowledge, research, and valuable recommendations on this very important topic. We've learned a lot, and you have planted the seeds for further discussion and out-of-the-box thinking based on research. Thank you, Dr. Reichman and Dr. Akbar, for your skillful moderating and a wonderful discussion that ensued. Let's continue to work together as an international community invested in the well-being of all. I must acknowledge the collaborative effort by everyone on the program committee who made this happen. In addition to those who have participated today, I want to thank Cynthia Grugurik, Yorker Gaba, Sonia Sochte, Laura Lopez Abar, Comfort Asanbi, Michelle Bell, and Vera Orohu Suarez. Thank you all from nearly every corner of the globe for participating in this program. We hope that next year we can once again hold Psychology Day at the United Nations. Until then, stay connected through our website or our Facebook page, and please make sure to follow the PCUN Facebook page as we'll be sharing updates. Stay safe and stay well.
Elke?